I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The people who immigrated from Japan basically came for a better life. Their country had changed the leadership. The emperor was now Meiji. He controlled the country. Many came because their families were so poor. They needed to send money back, and they would see some of these people who came over and were returning to Japan or sending money to their families, and their families were able to keep their little plots of land that they had been farming for centuries. As people heard more from others, their experiences, they decided, yes, they can go too. And then they sent for picture brides. And of course, some of the men had sent pictures not of themselves as they are, but as themselves as they were, as they were younger, or wearing somebody else's nice jacket, or in front of somebody else's nice house.
What they did is the men sent their pictures back to Japan and to a place or to a home or somewhere, and the ladies would go there and see these pictures. Such as my mother had 3 sisters, so she wanted to come to this country to start a new life also. She found this picture and she said, I'll take them. So what they did, the ladies did now, was that they took this picture to a place and they got married by proxy. Basically, there was a guy there and says, I want to marry this picture, and his name is so-and-so. So he said, no problem, to get married. So she got married to the picture. So now she had a marriage certificate. Now she could take the marriage certificate to the shipping lines and said, I have a husband. So now she had a husband and his picture. She got a ticket and over she came.
The Japanese people first came to the United States as hard-working laborers. They came as poor immigrants and were easily identified because of their physical appearance. When they were forced out of the labor market, they turned to what they knew best, farming. Fathers, mothers, and children worked together in the fields 7 days a week throughout the year. Consequently, the poor farming soil they were permitted to rent began over time to yield bountiful harvests. Their prosperity, however, provoked resentment and bitterness in many Americans. To make matters worse, by 1939, Japan, the country the immigrants had left behind, was engaged in a brutal war with allies of the United States.
The atmosphere in 1941-42 was so bad against the Japanese people. Discrimination was horrible. The newspapers, the Hearst newspapers, the radio, the only lines of communication we had in those days, they were all against us. And seems like every writer would write, they don't belong here, send them back to Japan. The radio would say, watch out for them because they're your enemy. Don't give them anything. Don't trust them to anything. This is 1941, before December 7. So the whole atmosphere was, these are, because there was a lot of jealousy as the Japanese people were prospering. So the atmosphere was, you're an enemy and you don't belong here. We don't want you here. There were signs all over, no Japs wanted.
On December 7, 1941, Emperor Hirohito of Japan declared war on the United States through a surprise bombing attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Because it was a surprise attack, on that day, more than 2,300 Americans lost their lives, and over 1,200 more were seriously injured. This vicious act of terror enraged the United States and acted as a catalyst to heave anger and hostility upon Japanese American families.
So what was I doing on the day Japan dropped the bomb on Pearl Harbor? Well, I had no idea what had happened until I went to school the next day. We were so happily working on the farm that Sunday, but when I went to school, all of a sudden my friends were avoiding me. And I'd walk down the hallway and they pretend they didn't see me, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I felt like I had done something terrible. And I said, well, how's it going to affect me? Where is Pearl Harbor? You know, I'm a citizen. I'm an American. I was born in Sacramento.
There wasn't anything said about what was going to happen to us, but because we knew that was Japan and our family was from Japan, that was of concern. The next day was a Monday, which was a school day. My very best friend, Mary Frances, came up to me and she said, I have to tell you something. My mama told me to tell you that I can't play with you anymore because you're Japanese. That really hurt me. My feelings were so hurt. I wanted to cry, but I was very brave. But I cried inside.
I was only 12 years old and really didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was. But I noticed that my parents were stunned and said very little, but their body language said that they were really concerned. We had a knock on the door, and there were 3 plainclothes men who happened to be the FBI. The search took about 2.5 hours, but the search was quite vigorous because they turned over the sofas to see if anything was hidden. Any books and photo albums were all checked over page by page, and they stripped away all the pictures.
Then there was this other agent in my parents' bedroom, and they were just dumping things out of the drawers and looking under the mattress, and then this third agent was in my bedroom, and he did the same thing. Then he opened my drawers and found my diary, and I was so, you know, you don't want anybody reading your diary. So anyway, I was ready to go and grab it, and I stopped myself, and things were, you know, tense as it was. I said, now, you might create more problems if you did that. Sit down.
On February 19, 1942, 74 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This executive order basically turned over control of the entire west coast of the United States to General John L. DeWitt. General DeWitt ordered all 112,000 men, women, and children of Japanese heritage living on the west coast to be rounded up and incarcerated in temporary assembly centers until permanent internment camps could be built. Without due process of law, they were forced to leave behind everything they had: their homes, pets, property, possessions, income, businesses, and their freedom, taking with them only what they could carry.
It was a time of turmoil. And another thing that upset so many people, including my dad and all the farmers, you know, farmers borrow against the crop that they're going to harvest. So they borrow from the bank, they plant the crops, and after the crops have been harvested, they get to pay the banks back. We were removed just before the harvest season. If there was a strategy or a plan in place to make sure that we lost our property and at least lost income, that was the way to do it. And my mother always lamented, why did they move us from our farms just at the beginning of the harvest season? Move us into temporary quarters that were just thrown together like fairgrounds and racetracks and temporary places, and then move us into our permanent camps in October when the harvest would have been over.
You know, you talk about enemy aliens. They couldn't put citizens in a concentration camp, so they had a new word for us that was non-alien. I became a non-alien. And so the big posters that I talked about, it said no pets allowed. That was one of big concern. On the day of evacuation, the dogs were so nervous. They just went around and round and round about us like, we want you to stay. We want you to stay. I know they sensed something.
And when we were ordered to go to camp, we had a dog that was been our pet for a number of years. And how do you tell a dog we're going to leave you? And I think it was just a matter of, we didn't say anything. We just left the dog.
Well, Tanforan was one of about 27 assembly centers located along the coast. Now, Tanforan Racetrack was eventually going to hold 8,000 people. Some of us lived in the stables. They had built barracks for other people to live in. Some of the single men lived in the grandstand. When we got there, we unloaded our things and we were assigned our stable that we were to live in. It was about 9 feet by 20 feet. We were given mattress covers and we were directed to a pile of hay, and what we were supposed to do was to put the hay into the mattress covers and put them onto the Army cots that we were to sleep on, and each of us had a cot. In my case, I went to Tanforan Racetrack, and we were there from roughly from the beginning of May until the end of August of 1942. The stable, of course, didn't have running water, so there was no cooking or no toilet facilities or showers in the stables.
My father, to help us feel better, because I don't think he knew how we felt, was, we're going on a train trip, won't that be fun? We'd never been on a train trip. The other thing to go with that was we get to have our own suitcases. So we went to the dime store, we got cardboard suitcases, not very sturdy. And then we had fun putting stuff in them. We had no idea what to put in there. We didn't know where we were going. Is it going to be hot, cold? I think I put in a couple of sweaters, a stuffed dog, a doll named Mary Lou, and a book.
We went on the train ride to Fresno. It was long, it was hot, and I remember turmoil. Children were crying, people were arguing. It was a hot and terrible ride. We didn't know what to expect. We only knew that we had to leave our homes. And it wasn't until we arrived at the Fresno Assembly Center, which was the old Fresno, I think, County Fairgrounds, and saw the barbed wire fences, we realized what was going to happen to us.
Getting into that train and that train moving away was a devastating time for me. I was just turned 19 in May, and we left in May. And I thought I thought the president would change his mind and say, you know, this is all wrong. Let's stop it. You may all go home. When that train started to move, I just couldn't help it. I just cried, broke down and just cried. When we got to Pinedale, the temporary camp, see, this camp was made for 5,000 inmates. And all around the place were guard towers with 2 guards up there and a machine gun. And they said, we're going to put you here for your protection. We said, how come that machine gun is pointing at us?
After Japan's military attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, racial prejudice against Japanese Americans grew more intense, simply because they looked like the people who had bombed Pearl Harbor. General John DeWitt, the Western Defense Commander, felt that Japanese Americans, their parents and grandparents living along the West Coast, were somehow going to join in and help Japan's military attack the United States. The timing of General DeWitt's assumption, immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, made it easy to convince government officials that all Japanese Americans and their families living within the exclusion zone on the west coast of the United States should be removed from their homes and forced to live in guarded internment camps. February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and within 3 months, Japanese Americans and their families living in the exclusion area were evacuated. Prior to this, they had been given the opportunity to move east, but the majority of them had nowhere else to go. The internment camps where they were to be sent were still under construction, which meant the evacuees were forced to live, some for several months, in what was called assembly centers. The assembly centers were nothing but racetrack stables, fairgrounds, and other public facilities where sanitation and living conditions were horrible. In the state of Washington, Puyallup, in Oregon, Portland, in California, Marysville, Sacramento, Stockton, Turlock, Merced, Tanforan, Salinas, Pinedale, Fresno, Tulare, Owens Valley, Pomona, Santa Anita. In Arizona, Parker Dam, and Mayer. Even though the barracks in the internment camps still weren't completely finished, Japanese Americans and their families were moved out of the assembly centers, packed into trains and trucks, treated like animals, and taken to their final destination, one of 10 internment camps located in 7 states from California to Arkansas. Tule Lake in the state of California, Minidoka in Idaho, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Topaz in Utah, Manzanar in California, Granada in Colorado, Poston in Arizona, Gila River in Arizona, Rower in Arkansas, Jerome in Arkansas. The internment camps were made of hundreds of barracks divided into blocks of 14. Each block had a mess hall, recreation hall, 2 latrines, and 2 shower areas. The barracks were scantily built of pine planking and tar paper. 6 families were assigned to a barrack, which meant that several family members would be living in a space no larger than 20 by 25 feet. These 10 internment camps became the forced residence for over 112,000 Japanese Americans and their families. There were numerous other smaller facilities that held community leaders, husbands, fathers, uncles, sons, grandfathers, that had been rounded up immediately after Pearl Harbor was bombed. For many of these men, it would be months, even years, before they would be reunited with their families in the internment camp.
We had a room 20 by 25 feet. In one barrack, we were in one room, and my brother and my cousins in the next room. The walls of the barrack were like these, where they just went up just so far. They did not reach the roof. And so there was space between the wall, the partition, and the roof. Throughout every barrack, people could hear babies cry. They could hear kids who argued. There was no privacy in the rooms. Between the cots here shows that there is a potty, porta potty basically, and chamber pot is what it was. And so that was one of my jobs, to carry our chamber pot after we all used it, to take it to the latrines to empty.
We were given these canvas bags. Later on, some of the soldiers told us they were body bags, but we didn't know that. We had to go out into the field and fill them with hay and straw. Now, I had asthma and hay fever, so that was not very comfortable. I wheezed and itched and carried on, sneezed all the time.
The only thing that I always remember back is that we would be playing outside, the kids, and they'd have these terrible, terrible dust storms where it would just pelt your skin, and then you couldn't open your eyes to see where you were going, so we didn't even know where our barrack was or anything. I just have flashes of memories like that.
When we realized what the camp setup was going to be about, my father said, okay, let's take a walk around and see what the whole thing is all about. And it was only because he oriented us to where the mess hall was, where we had to stand in line with our meal tickets that had to be punched, so forth, that you gradually understand that there's an order to this life.
Once the internees had moved into the camps, it became clear to the adults that it was up to them to make the best of their situation. In the Japanese culture, this is called gaman, enduring what seems unbearable, with patience and dignity. As a result, they held elections to select block leaders who would represent their concerns to camp administrators and would see that there was a degree of safety and regularity within the camp proper. The internees built schools, had sporting and recreational clubs, created magnificent art, staffed mess halls and clinics, and established police and fire departments within each camp. The adults worked hard to create a feeling of normalcy, especially for the children who now lived in a place surrounded by barbed wire fences and armed guards. Once government administrators were confident the internees were both productive and orderly, they gave them permission to purchase items for themselves from the Montgomery Ward and Sears catalog.
Every camp was a community, and we had our newspapers. Every camp had its newspaper, and of course that tells everybody what's going on, as well as telling people that they could try to be on the council. So in addition to having my own club, we also had a Girl Scout troop. And of course, we didn't have a sewing machine there, and so we ordered everything, including my Girl Scout uniform, from our catalogs. We had a Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward's catalog. My mother worked in the mess hall. She received $12 a month. That was her pay every month. And my father got $16 a month. And even if you were the greatest brain surgeon in the world and you were an internee, you would have gotten $19 a month. And our pay, I have been told, was based on the pay of the buck private. We're not supposed to get more than the buck private.
I remember how everybody assembled in the mornings and we raised the American flag and pledged allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. It's kind of ironic that we had been imprisoned basically by our own country, and then we still felt loyal to the United States and we pledged allegiance to our flag. Things I remember there, watching baseball, because the camp would form teams basically by area. So we had a Florin team, maybe a Lodi team, etc. Baseball was a very active sport. And then we watched movies on the side of a mountain. So I've always been a big movie fan, and I think I even enjoyed watching it outside on the side of a mountain.
Is that we'd see these cowboy and Indian movies, and we'd say, the Indians are going to come save us and we're going to get out of the camp. And years later, when I saw how powerless they were, I said, see, isn't that how a child is? You think someone's going to come save you, but they had no power to do anything like that.
I didn't want other people to say, oh, the Japanese had a good time in camp, because that was not true. You know, because for my sisters, you know, the teenagers, you know, the toilet situation, initially there were no partitions between the toilets, and the shower was a group shower. My sister said that they would wait until late in the night to go, just so that they wouldn't have to shower with everyone else.
On April 28, 1942, General John DeWitt sent orders that all orphaned children who had even one drop of Japanese blood in them were to be sent to the Manzanar internment camp. The 105 orphan children that were to be evacuated from the exclusion area were from the Shonian Japanese Orphanage, the Japanese Salvation Army Home, and the Maryknoll Catholic Home for Japanese Children. Lillian and Henry Matsumoto, then acting directors of the Shonan Japanese orphanage, pleaded that the children would not be a threat to national security. Their pleas were denied. However, the Matsumotos were able to convince government officials they would need separate buildings, other than the barracks, in order to properly care for the children, ranging from age 3 months to 17 years. The orphanage at Manzanar was called the Children's Village, and the Matsumotos dedicated their lives to the service of the orphaned children under their care.
The happiest time at Manzanar was knowing that I could play with the children and that they were safe while they were there.
By the time World War II ended in 1945, Japanese Americans who were removed from their homes on the West Coast had now lived in internment camp for 3.5 years. Over the course of their internment, Japanese Americans had assumed responsibility for maintaining their lives, their families, and their culture. During that 3.5-year period, internees were staffing camp operations, running printing presses, post offices, publishing camp newspapers, running machines and welding shops, shoe repair shops, and other camp community facilities. And because of their knowledge, skills, and patience as farmers, the Japanese American internees were able to develop vibrant, productive farm systems out of the arid desert lands where their camps were located. In February 1943, the U.S. government issued a loyalty questionnaire designed to identify Japanese American men whom they could draft into the military. Questions 27 and 28 had a devastating effect on Japanese American men and their families.
Question 28 was worse. If you were an immigrant from Japan in the 1930s, 40s, you could not be allowed to be a citizen. And question 28 asked for your complete loyalty to the United States and to give up any loyalty or citizenship to Japan. Okay, so if you were an Issei, an immigrant from Japan, not allowed citizenship in the United States, and you gave up that citizenship to Japan, you had no citizenship of any country.
So Japanese Americans suffered a great deal from having been put into the camps. We lost financially, we lost our freedom. I think we lost a certain amount of self-dignity or self-respect. Because you think about it, if your own country has imprisoned you, maybe some of the people had doubts about, gee, are we as good as other citizens too? So I think that had some kind of a effect psychologically on Japanese Americans.
Many internees living today still carry with them the personal burdens of racial prejudice and the injustice of betrayal from the country they loved. A month before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States government began a secret language school at Crissy Field on the Presidio of San Francisco. It was called the Military Intelligence Service Language School. They began teaching the Japanese language to a carefully selected group of U.S. soldiers, 58 Japanese Americans and 2 Caucasians. During the course of the war years, over 6,000 men and women graduates made up the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, and were engaged in active duty throughout the European and Pacific war zones. Their services proved invaluable, acting as interpreters, interrogators, and decoding intercepted Japanese battle orders. At this same time, many Japanese American men were already serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. However, shortly after Pearl Harbor was bombed, the government put a stop to any new Japanese American enlistments.
Immediately after Pearl Harbor, my classmates and I, 3 Caucasian friends, went down to Long Beach Naval Base, and we tried to enlist. My friends, my classmates, Ed Hardage, Roy Kettner, Jimmy Keys, they were taken in immediately. And they came to me, they said, we can't take you. And I was upset. I said, why not? I'm an American too. They said, well, you're not 1A, you're 4C, designated, which means enemy alien. So immediately, I was no longer a United States citizen. I was an enemy alien. So I was unable to join any branch of the military service of the United States.
But as the war went on and, U.S. American troops are getting killed in this big world war of ours, everybody recognized that we need as many soldiers as possible. So somebody came up with the idea, why don't we form a segregated unit of Japanese American soldiers? So the first thing they did was they went to Hawaii, which was just a territory then. Japanese Americans were not evacuated from Hawaii like the mainlanders into the internment camps. They needed that Japanese American workforce essentially for the sugar cane fields or working in hospitals, the military bases, etc. So they were not evacuated. So because of that high concentration of Japanese Americans in Hawaii, the U.S. Army went to Hawaii and asked for volunteers to form a single battalion. So they asked for 1,000 men to volunteer, and they actually got like 4,000 or 5,000 that volunteered.
The 100th Battalion was formed by Hawaiian National Guard recruits in Hawaii and sent them eventually from Hawaii to Camp Snelling, Minnesota. And from there, they formed what was called the 100th Battalion, just one battalion of the Nisei soldiers. And they were shipped overseas in September of 1943, way before the 442nd. So they were in North Africa, attached to the 34th Division, and went into combat in southern Italy, Sicily, invasion of Italy, going up the boot. And they were quite courageous in battle and had so many casualties that they were called the Purple Heart Battalion.
The bravery, courage, and valor of the 100th Battalion Japanese Hawaiians were a fitting testimony to the loyalty and commitment of these men serving in combat in the United States Army. Their outstanding heroism and loyalty was the exact opposite of what General John DeWitt, Colonel Carl Bendenson, and other military officials had predicted. As the war went on, the United States government was faced with the growing need to replace the troops that had been wounded or killed in battle. And so, aware of the outstanding valor of the men of the 100th Battalion, the government reversed their classification for Japanese American men from 4C, enemy alien, to 1A, which meant these men were now eligible for enlistment.
So what the Army sent teams of Army recruiters to the 10 concentration camps and to various large cities where the Nisei boys were living, tried to convince them that they should volunteer for the military. Well, there was an immediate question of, what about our civil rights? Give us our liberty. Give us our freedom. Let us out of prison. Then we will volunteer. And of course, The government wasn't going to do that. They're going to keep you locked up. So the sentiment was, well, I don't know if we should do this. Quite a huge segment of the population in the camps said, no, we will not do it. But then, looking at it, a number of the boys thought, what if we don't? What's going to happen? Will we ever get out of jail? The big rumor going around the camps were that the Japanese people were going to be sent to Japan in exchange for American war prisoners that Japan was holding. Well, possibly so. So there were enough young Nisei boys that said, we don't care, we have to volunteer, we have to go serve our country. If we don't, we have no idea what can happen to our families. So that way, approximately 4,000 young Nisei boys did volunteer, and that's how the 442nd was formed. The 442nd was a very unique group of people, and of course it was the first that the military had, so they really didn't know what to do. In fact, the first shoulder patch that they issued was a yellow dagger, armed with a red blood hanging on it. I mean, can you imagine that? So the 442nd officer said, we can't have that. So there was a boy in F Company, a boy from Watsonville, in fact. He designed the current six-sided patch with the hand holding the statue of the Torch of Liberty, and that's our patch, and it always, since then, it always has been. Well, the boys from Hawaii were a carefree, happy-go-lucky bunch of boys. They loved to gamble. And of course, when they would gamble, payday would come, and they would spread out their blanket and start rolling their dice and shoot craps, play poker. And it was like, we have to take everybody's money. And it was go for broke, win or take all. And you didn't just say, well, that's enough, I quit. It was, you quit when you either won it all or you lost it all. So go for broke, and that was it. That was it, and became the motto, and became the war battle cry and battle also.
The newly formed 442nd Infantry was made up of Japanese-American men who had volunteered from the 10 internment camps, from the inland states, and from Hawaii. They were sent to Fort Shelby for combat training, and then joined the Japanese-Hawaiian 100th Battalion in Italy. By that time, fierce combat had already taken the lives of over half the men of the 100th. The three combined battalions of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team are recognized to this day as the most decorated regiment for its size in the history of the United States military.
The 442nd made up of brothers, actual brothers, cousins, uncles, very closely related. There were many who grew up all 18, 19, 20 years of their lives, grew up together, going to the same schools, playing together. So a very close-knit unit. I think that was the main reason why there was so much valor on the battlefield. You see your buddies get shot up, and you're out there to protect them. I saw medics go out there, and when the firefight is just completely so solid that you can't make a move, and they just run out there to take care of the wounded.
The 442 went on, and they fought in Italy and France, and their record was just very significant as far as their valor and gallantry in action. One of the significant battles was called the Battle of the Lost Battalion. And in this battle, there was a battalion of the 36th Division of the Texas National Guard unit that had advanced too quickly, and they were encircled by the Germans. So they were starting to run low on ammunition, supplies. Two units of the Texas Division tried to rescue them, and they were repulsed by the Germans. So the commander asked the people to send in somebody. It was a desperate situation, so the 442nd was picked to rescue these guys. And after 4 or 5 days of battle, the 442nd rescued them, and they saved 211 Texans. But the cost of that rescue was over 800 casualties for the 442nd.
During the battle to rescue the Lost Battalion in October 1944, we were in very heavy winter weather. It was raining, cold, it even snowed. And then when the cold weather hit, the fog came in. And we're in the trees, in the mud, trying to fight the enemy. And now we can't see. We can only see 15 or 20 feet because of the fog. So my orders to the squad members were, be very careful, stay closer together. You can't spread out. You can't go too far ahead. Look out, if you see an object, watch to see what kind of a helmet he's wearing. If it's straight across, it's an American helmet. If it dips down over the ear, it's a German helmet. So it's all we could do. We could hear them talking, they could hear us talking, because you couldn't use hand signals anymore. You had to holler to each other. It was treacherous. And you had to get very close because you couldn't see anymore. This is a tough time. This is late October 1944.
The 442nd, I mean, the Japanese Americans were so proud of these guys, and even President Truman was aware of their record. And when they returned from Europe, President Truman asked them to march down Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., and he pinned the Presidential Unit citation on their flag, and he made some profound words for the troops. He said, you fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice. And you won.
The Japanese American men who served with the 100th Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service were not alone. Japanese American women who wanted to serve their country volunteered for the Women's Army Corps and the Cadet Nurse Corps. Their work in the medical fields, their service as translators, researchers, instructors, clerks, and typists was as dedicated as the men in the MIS and the 3 battalions of the 442nd. Together, the faithful and loyal services of the Japanese American men and women played a central role in keeping our country safe, liberating our allies, and most importantly, bringing an end to the death and destruction of World War II. Near the end of 1945, the United States government began releasing over 100,000 remaining Japanese Americans that were being held in internment camps throughout the West and Midwest. For the internees, rather than a sense of relief after 3 years of incarceration, leaving the camp confines carried with it the heavy burden of anxiety, uncertainty, and fear. They were afraid to return home for 3 main reasons. First, because of the devastation and slaughter Japan had inflicted upon the United States, Japanese Americans feared they would be looked upon and treated as America's enemies. Secondly, still painfully aware of the resentment and prejudice many citizens still held towards Japanese American farmers and business owners, the internees were uncertain and anxious about their future economic survival. Finally, because Japanese American internees had little faith that their civil rights would be honored, they feared the police, fire department, and local governments would do little to protect them if a crisis arose. As a result, newly freed Japanese Americans were understandably nervous and fearful of returning home, not even knowing if their homes or farms still existed.
When the war ended with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the camps began to close. I believe that there was a court ruling also. But remember, if you lost your farm, if you had sons that served in the 442 or in the Pacific and died, and you were 70 years old, what would you go to? Where would you go? There was no farm. Your children were scattered. Maybe your son didn't die, but he's still in the army. Where would you go? What would you do? This was a dilemma for some people. Some were lucky, like our family. Bob Fletcher saved our farm. The Jenkins had made sure that nobody burned my grandfather's house. Some people had a place to go, but many didn't. And in this area around Sacramento, about 85% did not return.
Many people have talked about the difficulties they had in returning, and not just finding housing, because they didn't have any home to go back to, or in some cases they had their home and all the furniture that was in the house had been stolen. They lost everything. But we were fortunate. We had our things stored in the church. And when my father and mother and younger brother came back to Bakersfield, they were able to stay in the church, using the church as the hostel. And some other families also lived in those rooms.
The minister at the Parkview Japanese Presbyterian Church opened up the church as a hostel. So people returning would go there and sleep in the church, in the social hall, and temporarily, and until they found their own housing. And that really helped. But they said it was very difficult to find housing. A lot of people won't rent to Japanese.
I understand that there was a family living in our home at the time of our return, and that my father eventually had to go find a place for them to move to before they would leave. And then the topper was that my sisters said that it was just a total wreck. The bathrooms were filled with garbage. The floors had about an inch or two of just crud.
Even though the evacuees knew they had done nothing wrong, being held in the internment camps month after month, year after year, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, many Japanese Americans began to feel as though they really were bad people. Finally, when they were released from camp, many older adults had already lost confidence in themselves, no longer having the energy, the will, or the resources to start life over again. The children, too, were fearful of returning to the schools they had once attended. Thankfully for them, there were many caring teachers and students that came forward to welcome the Japanese American children and accept them as friends. Sadly, however, other Japanese American children were not so fortunate. Their teachers, seemingly without concern, reinforced the feelings of inferiority and worthlessness that most Japanese American children had already begun to feel about themselves.
For a long time after we left the camp, nobody wanted to talk about it. You know, when you're put into a place like that with barbed wire and sentries around it and not allowed to leave, you feel shamed. You feel like you must have done something wrong. Even if I don't feel like I've done anything wrong, it must have been something about me that was bad.
That experience coming out, I guess by that time I was 10 and I was, you know, having lived with nothing but Japanese people, you know, all these 3 years, I was afraid of going out to a new place because I thought, oh, they're going to call us dirty Japs. Because I guess in those days, I must have felt like it was our fault that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor. And so I did have feelings like that.
When I came home, I realized that there was so much anti-Japanese feeling, and it came to me in the classroom or outside. People were still calling us names, and very often they were more likely to say bad things to children than to a grown-up. In the classroom, the teacher handled things very differently. Miss Webster, my 6th grade teacher, and we had News Friday. People read a news event and they would give a report. And very often the boys would talk about where we were in the war. Even though the war was over by September of 1945, there were still activities going on in the Far East or in Germany or wherever. And wherever they were talking about things that might affect the Japanese. They were using the language that was seen in the newspapers. They used the word Japs instead of Japanese, and that was a not nice word. It's a derogatory word. And Miss Webster would say, "Oh, Wayne, let's use the word Japanese. That's so much nicer." And so pretty soon Wayne is talking about Japanese now. And then the next Friday somebody else, Franklin, is talking about the Japs. And here we go again. Miss Webster say, "Oh, let's say Japanese, that nice word." And about the third time that somebody says it, that's the last time we ever had it. So she used that way of nicely correcting. I think that plus the lady who helped me in the school ground, it just generated this feeling of how can we help children become accepted and inclusive. Whereas this other little boy, George Takei, who is now an actor, and he came back, he was in the 3rd grade, and he went to school in Los Angeles too. He had a different experience and a different teacher, and that teacher called him the Jap boy. She would not call him, his given name was George. And somebody said to him, because he's writing this in his memoirs, in his book, "Didn't you know that that was a bad word, and why didn't you say something about it?" He said, "I knew it was a bad word, but I knew I was a bad person because I was in prison. So I deserved to be called a bad word." See, that's what the internment did to him, put it into his mind that he had this prison experience, therefore he was bad.
A lot of the young Japanese Nisei and Sansei went into, you might say, private practice, like medicine, dentistry, law, because they felt they couldn't get regular jobs like an engineer in firms. They wouldn't be hired. So they went into something that they could do themselves. And of course, they became famous as you know, most people say, well, they want somebody that's maybe Japanese to be my dentist or my doctor. You know, so the feeling from pre-war to after-war changed a lot.
The period after World War II saw the beginning of societal change for Japanese American people. After the war had ended and the internees returned home, it was extremely difficult for Japanese Americans to get a job working for other people. This is when many decided to risk going out on their own, some as professionals, and others as farmers, pooling their resources to create farm co-ops. The farm co-ops enabled Japanese American farmers to work together, sharing resources and know-how, rather than competing against each other as rivals in the marketplace. During this same time, many Americans began to realize the terrible injustices the United States had committed against the Japanese American people, stripping them of their precious civil rights without just cause. Returning Caucasian soldiers who had fought with the Japanese American troops were now standing up for these men and their families, praising their bravery, courage, and valor as soldiers of the United States military. Times were indeed changing.
There were 30 documented cases of drive-by shootings, arson, dynamiting of buildings, signs in stores, "No Japs allowed here," and things like that. But it changed rather dramatically after World War II. Social changes take generations to change, but it changed overnight there. Pretty soon, these people went to school, became politicians into decision-making positions, and in 1952, almost all of the 500 laws that I previously mentioned were gone. They were overturned. I think it was a combination of sacrifices made by the Japanese Americans who fought in the war and the Caucasian soldiers that fought with them. They brought about these changes.
Racial prejudice is one of 3 principal reasons why, without bringing any charges against them, President Roosevelt and the elected officials of the United States Congress voted to force 112,000 Japanese American families into American concentration camps. Forced to leave their homes, essentially robbed of everything they had, not the least of which was their self-worth, their dignity, and worst of all, America's cherished promise to them, a chance for a better life. Some Americans, however, knew what was happening to them was both intolerable and unjust. At the risk of losing their friends, their jobs, or their social standing, these Americans stood beside their Japanese American neighbors and did what they knew in their hearts was right. Here are a few of their stories.
My parents, Ralph and Mary Smeltzer, grew up in Southern California. They were both members of the Church of the Brethren, which is a historic peace church, liberal Protestants, and they were school teachers in Los Angeles. They were also pacifists, so they were opposed to the war, to World War II. And then, since they were living in LA when December 7, 1941 happened, they were living near Japanese American communities. And then when the Exclusion Act came down, the order from Roosevelt, all of a sudden their neighbors were being rounded up and put in the horse stalls of the county fairgrounds. So they, along with other religious pacifists, the Quakers, the Friends, as well as the Brethren, they started organizing to support the Japanese Americans in detention. So because they were opposed to the war, they were in danger of losing their jobs as teachers. And in fact, as pacifists, they refused to sell war stamps. Evidently, teachers were asked to sell war stamps to support the war effort. So my dad lost his teaching job and was made a long-term substitute. So the writing was on the wall that they weren't going to be able to remain as teachers in the LA school district after the war started. That summer, as you know, the Japanese were being moved into the camps, they then decided to quit their jobs in LA, and they went to the federal government and applied to be teachers at Manzanar. So they were actually hired by the federal government as civilian employees and went to Manzanar, I think in September, to start teaching high school in the camp. Initially at Manzanar, they lived outside the camp with the other Caucasians, but they were very uncomfortable living with the Caucasians and just going into the camp to teach. So they asked to be assigned to a barracks in the camp. And so they ended up assigned as house parents in a barracks of young men called Kibei, who were Japanese Americans who'd been sent back to Japan for their education. The camps were a very difficult place to live, and my parents knew that if someone in the camp had a sponsor, someone who would help them find housing and help them find a job, they could get permission to leave the camp as long as they left the West Coast, as long as they left the exclusion zone. And so they knew that people were setting up relocation hostels through the Quakers, through other church groups. And so my parents asked the Church of the Brethren if they would help my parents set up a relocation hostel. And the Brethren said they would at the seminary in Chicago, at the Brethren Seminary. So around March, my dad actually left the camp and went to other camps to set up contacts so that they could get applications from different camps for people to come. And then my mother left Manzanar with several people from the camp to Chicago, to the seminary. And so initially they set up the relocation hostel at the seminary. So people would apply from the camps to the hostel. And if my parents accepted them, then they could leave the camp. And my parents agreed to provide housing and help them get jobs in the Chicago area. After they were at the seminary for a while, they then rented a big house on the North Shore of Chicago so they could bring more people. And so they had this big house, and people would apply to come to the hostel from different camps, and my parents would accept them. And so in the next 2 years, my parents helped about 1,000 people leave the camps, various camps, come to Chicago, live in the hostel until they could find their own place to live and get jobs.
I know that the president of the University of California, Berkeley, Robert Gordon Sproul, got together the heads of different universities, and they said, well, we really need an agency to do this, to help the students relocate, but we don't have the personnel to do it. Well, then they found out that the Quakers were willing to do it. So this whole student relocation program was done by the Quakers.
I had been working with the American for Service Committee because when I walked into that service committee office in 1958, I told them I wanted to do something for them. So they put me on all kinds of committees. And the last committee I was on was called the National Affirmative Action Committee. And we met in Philadelphia. And for one meeting, I got there very early, so I got permission to look into their archives. And I looked for boxes that said Student Relocation Committee, because that was a committee that was helping out the Japanese American college students. And I took out one of the boxes, and I was amazed to see it was all for one student, one Japanese student, and they had written all these letters to the college town, or the organization, asking for their cooperation and help, and making sure that the student is going to be welcomed and treated well. And I thought about just looking at the math, that's about 100,000 letters. And these letters were written before the days of the computer. And it was all done in the carbon paper duplicates or mimeograph machines. And just thinking, you know, look at all the work that these people had done.
So Governor Carr fondly referred to the melting pot of the United States. He was fond of saying that the Constitution doesn't start out, we the people who are descendants of the English or of the French or of the Scandinavians. It says we the people of the United States, and that meant people of all races, people from all countries. That's what made this country great. That's the melting pot that Governor Carr spoke so highly of and held dear to the end of his life. So at a time when American citizens were being placed in internment camps, guarded by military police with machine guns without evidence of wrongdoing or any trial to determine guilt, Governor Carr's message to people out there was, what's to say that 6 months from now, you and I will not follow in that same internment camp, guarded by military police with machine guns without evidence of wrongdoing or any trial to determine guilt? What are we fighting for abroad if not to protect these very ideals at home? These ideals that the individual's rights, the Constitution, which is as sacred a document to Ralph Carr as any but the Bible, would have been violated and lost. Principles, Ralph Carr was fond of saying, are as true as truth and will last as long as God's creation. So Governor Carr said to the American-born citizen with Japanese parents, we look to you for example and guidance. And to the people who were not born in this country, he said we would extend the hand of friendship, secure in the knowledge that you will be as truly American as the rest of us. You can imagine at that time just how different that stand was, and really at a time when all of the other governors and all of the other nations' politicians were being critical of anyone of Japanese descent. It's rare to find any politician like Governor Carr who's willing to extend any hand of friendship toward them. So in the late part of 1941 and the early part of 1942, Governor Carr was being criticized pretty much every single day on the front page of the Denver Post. It was the most read newspaper in the state of Colorado and pretty much throughout the entire Mountain West. Fast forward about 50 some odd years, and that same individual who was lambasted every single day on the front pages of that paper was at the end of the 20th century named Colorado's Man of the Century. And you want to know why? Because the newspaper said it was a decision of substance over style. They said Ralph Carr didn't bring the ski industry to Colorado. He didn't make a famous beer. He didn't even help him win a football Super Bowl or anything like that. But what Ralph Carr did, according to the newspaper, was he took a stand on behalf of people, a stand on behalf of individuals, a stand on behalf of liberty that simply would leave Colorado a more pleasant place, a more welcoming place to live in the next century.
What prompted me to write the book In Good Conscience, Supporting Japanese Americans During the Internment? Actually, when I was writing the book, we were deeply involved in the Iraq War. George W. Bush had just won election for the second time. And a lot of my friends who had been very active in trying to end the war were very discouraged. But I was writing this book about these people who stepped up after the incarceration, quit their jobs even, went to work in the camps because they knew they had to do something. Virginia Swanson was a Baptist missionary at Terminal Island, an isolated village in Los Angeles Harbor. When Japanese fishermen and their families were suddenly forced off the island with nowhere to go, Swanson rallied churches and community groups to provide emergency shelter. She supported Japanese Americans for the rest of her life. Reverend Herbert Nicholson, a Quaker missionary, served a Japanese congregation in Los Angeles. When they were sent to Manzanar, he brought them books, supplies, even a piano for church services. He visited all the camps many times, even the secret Department of Justice camps, and persuaded local and federal authorities to recognize their loyalty. Teacher Elizabeth Humbarger identified with Japanese American students at Stockton High School because she'd experienced anti-German prejudice during World War I. When her students were incarcerated at the local fairgrounds, she obtained surplus textbooks from the school district and helped her students organize a school behind barbed wire. Dr. Joseph Goodman, a Quaker and conscientious objector, left a prestigious job at San Francisco's Steinhardt Aquarium to teach at the Topaz internment camp in Utah. His social studies classes restored his students' faith in democracy. He urged them to apply for college, taught them how to negotiate with camp administrators, sponsored the student yearbook, and coached a winning football team. His students never forgot him.
I lived with Dr. Busch's family, and so I was very exposed to everything about what the Quakers were doing. I remember when I was working for him, he kept loaning money to students who needed money to go to school, or our family that had nothing and wanted to start something. He would loan them money. And this is the kind of person he was. Of course, an assembly center was more or less a temporary. It was not the permanent place. And so Dr. Busch used to come and visit me on Sundays, and he tried to bring things that would help to keep the spirit of the people more lively. Dr. Busch brought albums, and we had this Santa Anita racetrack, so we had this big arena to give people a chance to gather together and listen to beautiful classical music. So we had what is called a music appreciation night, and we had this every Sunday, and it was just wonderful because it seemed, you know, with the music just blaring out into the air, and it was really a happy moment for 1 hour for all the people in camp that enjoyed music of that kind.
Slavery was a dehumanizing institution for America's minorities, especially blacks. It wasn't until the late 1950s and 60s that African Americans developed the vision and the will for the civil rights movement to emerge. Their determined struggle against racism and injustice prompted other minorities, including Japanese Americans, to work for justice on their own behalf. Beginning in 1868, Japanese immigrants began fleeing to the United States to escape the ruthless leadership and oppressive systems under which they were forced to live. They came, willing to work hard to secure their families' safety and well-being. Similar to the Japanese on the West Coast in 1942, a minority population, rounded up, forced to board trains, not knowing where they were being taken. Would they be harmed? Or even killed? Living in constant fear as to what their future and the futures of their children would be. A comparable scenario may be playing out at our southern borders with the incarceration of immigrant families. Children and adults living in fear, separated from one another, confused over where they're to be taken, waiting, worrying about their own safety and the safety of their children. Regarding the racism and injustice behind the rounding up and incarceration of Japanese Americans, President Ronald Reagan, about to sign the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, stated, "The internment of Japanese Americans was a mistake." This leaves Americans with the far-reaching dilemma regarding human rights. Is the rounding up and incarceration of immigrant minorities a justifiable decision or a major mistake? In 1980, inspired by the heroism and the determination of the civil rights movement, a group of Japanese Americans began work for redress and a formal apology for the incarceration of Japanese Americans from the President of the United States.
What happens to minorities in America? And for us, the civil rights movement really was liberating, because what we realized was that we could fight for the things we believed in. We could fight for equality, but we would have to do it each for ourselves. Latinos did it, and later we did it as we began the redress campaign. But this was not something that was universal during the movement itself. The civil rights movement was about Black America, and rightfully as it should have been.
Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL, was organized in 1929 by young Japanese Americans for the purpose of protecting civil rights. The incarceration of 112,000 Japanese Americans and their families, and nearly 8,000 more, held without cause by the Department of Justice and the U.S. Army, had weighed heavily on the membership of JACL. Various ways of dealing with redress and reparation had been discussed over the years, but never formally acted on. All that was to change in Salt Lake City at the 1978 JACL National Convention.
I decided we've talked long enough, and I launched the campaign from the convention. I sent a press release out saying that Japanese Americans were demanding $25,000. The minute we said we are demanding money, then all of a sudden it became this really kind of ugly issue of, how dare you do this? Most Americans had no idea this had happened. And for me, the focus had to be education. That until we could educate the American public, we would never get a bill through the Congress. But what was really important about the whole campaign was the JACL's discussion always focused on the need to do something so that this could never happen again in this country. And I would tell audiences all over the country that this isn't about money. We don't care about the money. What we care about is that you understand what led us into those camps, why we were imprisoned, and why we lost everything and were willing to come back and do what we could for this country. I put together a committee to talk about how we were going to approach this issue. By then, it was a public issue. It had been picked up by media all over the country, and mainly negative media coverage, like the Wall Street Journal that said, "How dare you do this?" And that was pretty much the nature of most of the media coverage at that point. And so I had a meeting with my committee. Did we want to fight this as a legal issue and go to the courts, or as a public campaign, or what? And in the course of that conversation, there was a man on the committee named Raymond Okamura from Berkeley, a chemist from Berkeley, who said, don't you think we ought to ask the 4 Japanese American members of Congress, Daniel Inouye, a United States Senator from Hawaii, Spark Matsunaga, who was also a Senator from Hawaii, and Norman Mineta, a member of Congress of the House, and newly elected to the Congress was Bob Matsui from Sacramento. And about 20 minutes into the meeting, he said, Inoue turned to us and said, have you fellows ever considered a federal commission? I hated the idea because, in my view, nothing ever comes of these reports. But Inoue said to us in that meeting, think about the strategy on this. The more I thought about this approach, the more I realized this was probably the only way we had a chance to get anywhere successfully. And so the JACL adopted this position that it would seek a bill to get a federal commission started. Every political pundit we ever talked to said, you're not gonna succeed. This is doomed to failure. This has never been attempted in the history of this country before. And the reason it won't succeed is because you have to get Congress, first of all, to acknowledge that there was an injustice. And when has the Congress ever done that?
The JACL committee began its work on a bill to present to Congress, establishing a federal commission to determine the cause behind the wartime relocation and the internment of Japanese Americans.
Both bills got reconsidered after they went into markup and into a conference and went to the White House, and Jimmy Carter approved the bill, signed the bill into law, which created the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. Personal justice denied was the commission report, and said unequivocally that the internment of Japanese Americans was a consequence of race, of politics, and a failure of leadership.
Spearheaded by the commission report, it was, in the end, what people themselves did to bring about change. The Civil Liberties Act became law because of public pressure, diligence, patience, and a passion for justice, all necessary components in any quest for change.
Members of Congress and distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent. Yes, the nation was then at war, struggling for its survival, and it's not for us today to pass judgment upon those who may have made mistakes while engaged in that great struggle. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For throughout the war, Japanese Americans in the tens of thousands remained utterly loyal to the United States. Indeed, scores of Japanese Americans volunteered for our armed forces, many stepping forward in the internment camps themselves. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up entirely of Japanese Americans, served with immense distinction to defend this nation, their nation. Yet back at home, the soldiers' families were being denied the very freedom for which so many of the soldiers themselves were laying down their lives. Congressman Norman Mineta, with us today, was 10 years old when his family was interned. In the congressman's words, my own family was sent first to Santa Anita Racetrack. We showered in the horse paddocks, Some families lived in converted stables, others in hastily thrown together barracks. We were then moved to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, where our entire family lived in one small room of a rude tar paper barrack. Like so many tens of thousands of others, the members of the Moneta family lived in those conditions not for a matter of weeks or months, but for 3 long years. The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors, surviving Japanese Americans, of the 120,000 who were relocated or detained. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. I'd like to note that the bill I'm about to sign also provides funds for members of the Aleut community who were evacuated from the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands after a Japanese attack in 1942.
Racism as we know it today stems from an attitude that accompanied European settlers to the shores of North America. They believed in the superiority of white Europeans and their culture over those of the native peoples they encountered. This same attitude of superiority, consciously or unconsciously, continues to this day to undermine the human potential of those whose skin color is other than that of white Europeans. Maintaining an attitude of dominance and degradation toward minorities cripples the gift that diversity has to offer and intensifies the loss of greatness for our country.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. In 1787, when the framers of our Constitution began with "We the people of the United States," in order to form a more perfect union, their intention was for citizens to engage with the Constitution as a living document, one that could be amended to reflect the intelligence, justice, and circumstances of each generation to follow. The framers counted on and expected every citizen to participate in the politics of government, continuing their work towards becoming a more just and perfect union. Even though at that time, the only citizens whose voices were to be heard were those of white male landowners. Throughout history, changes have been made at times of intense social pressure and shifting attitudes. Advancing the promise of a living constitution, the Founding Fathers came to the realization that slavery was both divisive and immoral, and amended the Constitution to abolish slavery. The women's right to vote came about through social consciousness and persistent pressure over a 70-year period, making it clear to the President and Congress what had been intolerable for women. In each case, it was the recognition of injustice and strong public pressure that the Constitution was able to be set into place, the 13th and 19th Amendment, furthering the framers' promise of a living Constitution, addressing oppression, and furthering the work of forming a more perfect union. Where have we come from in our history? And more importantly, where are we going? Will the lure of power and influence blind us to our own detriment? What are the mistakes we've made in the past? And if we choose to continue as a democracy, how do we make certain that we do not recreate these same mistakes for ourselves again? In order to learn from one of our country's biggest mistakes, the internment of Japanese American families held against their will in American concentration camps during World War II, we have to understand the conditions which made it politically feasible and publicly acceptable to deprive American citizens of their constitutional rights. In 1980, a federal commission was created by Congress to study the causes that brought about the internment of nearly 120,000 members of Japanese American families. After 3 years of hearings, in 1983, the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians published their findings in a report called personal justice denied, citing the three main causes of the internment. The first cause was racism. Japanese immigrants began arriving in the United States during the 1880s, replacing Chinese laborers who were no longer welcome. Although the Chinese composed an insignificant number of the nation's population, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in order to appease worker demands and satisfy prevalent concerns about maintaining white racial purity. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States. Because the Chinese had been targets of racism, and the new Japanese immigrants had physical characteristics similar to the Chinese, the Japanese people were ostracized, labeled as different, untrustworthy, and treated as less than human. Anti-Japanese agitation also fed on racial stereotypes and the fear of so-called yellow peril. The Asian population seemed to be growing faster than the white population, even though the ethnic Japanese never exceeded 3% of everyone living in California. There was a commonly accepted bogus theory that Japanese could not or would not assimilate into the American culture, and those who spoke English poorly or with a heavy accent were particularly ostracized. As with the Jewish people in Nazi Germany, having been blamed for many of Germany's economic troubles, Japanese Americans were a convenient scapegoat of demagogues eager to place blame for any number of political and economic issues. Because the principal occupation of Japanese immigrants was in agriculture, they received significant hostility from white farmers, who perceived them as an economic threat. Yet after years of living productive lives in the United States, in the eyes of the US government, the Japanese were here strictly as laborers, never to be given the right to own land, and never permitted a path to citizenship. That was then. This is now. Where is racism today? The second cause for the internment of Japanese Americans was determined to be war hysteria, which today would be called the politics of fear or fear-mongering. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a widespread belief, contrary to all evidence, that the attack had been aided by the sabotage and espionage of ethnic Japanese living in Hawaii. This fear and scapegoating erupted into anger and hate, punishing innocent people by burning their homes, stealing their property, taking their farms and businesses, and otherwise undermining their self-worth, pride, and their sense of personal dignity. From politicians to journalists, in movies and books, in schools, universities, and national organizations, each incited fear through socially accepted derogatory propaganda. Any American of Japanese ancestry was the hated enemy. These fears were what allowed those in power to justify racist policies, with the argument that imprisoning ethnic Japanese living on the West Coast was necessary in order to protect the safety of Americans. This justification completely negated the fact that most of those sent to the camps were American citizens. Fear is a dangerous thing. It has been used to justify some of the most heinous actions, completely outweighing the importance of facts. In America today, you can shoot and kill another person and walk away without punishment if you can prove that you were afraid and acting out of self-defense, regardless of whether your fear was justified. But we rarely stop to wonder where fear comes from. Some have said it originates from memories of prehistoric survival clashes that remain hidden in our limbic brain, suggesting it's a subconscious mechanism that sees the other as a threat. Is it rational? Or is fear irrational, stemming from thoughts or feelings based on repeated exposure to messages from the media, from institutional practices, cultural ideology, or from family bias passed down from one generation to the next? That was then. This is now. Where is the politics of fear today? The third cause for the internment of Japanese Americans was determined to be the failure of political leadership. Part of the failure of political leadership was political self-preservation at the cost of Japanese American lives. No politician wanted to be blamed for further attacks on American soil for failing to take action, so even those who felt differently about what was being decided failed to speak out. Decisions based on keeping one's job overrode the actual search for truth. Some agencies in the federal government were for the incarceration, while others were against it. It was never a unanimous decision, but when enough power and influence was brought to bear by both political parties, the decision was made to imprison Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. The president's executive order was a blatant violation of the 14th Amendment. The cause for this breach of the 14th Amendment was later on acknowledged to be a fabrication based on racial fear. The Assistant Secretary of War at the time revealed the prevailing attitude of those in charge when he said, "The Constitution is just a piece of paper to me." Conversely, reports from other government agencies studying the potential threat from Japanese Americans on the West Coast stated that the Japanese people were extremely loyal to the United States, and therefore there was no need for imprisoning them because of a so-called military necessity. These reports, however, were never taken into account. President Roosevelt, giving way to his own racial bias and receiving intense political pressure from Congress, violated his only oath of office, namely to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. He signed Executive Order 9066, stating that the Japanese internment was a military necessity. On February 19, 1942, the president sentenced nearly 120,000 innocent people to American concentration camps. That was then. This is now. Where is the failure of political leadership today? Powerful, ambitious men, blind to their own prejudice, helped to spread this race-based sense of fear, and were major contributors to the failure of political leadership. Justification for internment from people like Chief Justice Earl Warren, then the Attorney General of California, helped to seal the fate of Japanese American people. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Warren organized the state's civil defense program, warning in January of 1942 that the Japanese situation as it exists in this state today may well be the Achilles heel of the entire civil defense effort. Warren was a vocal proponent of forcibly removing all Japanese Americans from the West Coast. It was only years later, after retiring as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, that Warren wrote in his memoirs, "I deeply regretted the removal order and my own testimony advocating it, because it was not in keeping with our American concept of freedom and the rights of citizens. Whenever I thought of the innocent little children who were torn from home, school, friends, and congenial surroundings, I was conscience-stricken. It was wrong to react so impulsively, without positive evidence of disloyalty." As the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, this was his deepest source of shame and most egregious failure, knowing that even regret was not enough to erase the damage he had done. Another example of men who wielded their power and prejudice to further the effect of racist fear came from the unlikely pen of Theodore Seuss Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. In his editorial cartoons, Seuss took advantage of the physical differences between Japanese and Europeans. His cartoons aided to increase paranoia and fear, especially on the West Coast. Later on, however, as he began to understand how his work was supporting the spread of anti-Japanese propaganda, Seuss worked to make amends for what he had done. He traveled to Japan to experience and learn who the Japanese people really were. Upon his return, he wrote the book Horton Hears a Who, in which he stresses the power of a single voice making all the difference for the people of a tiny city called Whoville. When you look at the three causes of internment cited by the Commission, namely racism, war hysteria, or the politics of fear, and the failure of political leadership, it's not difficult to find parallels in our current political system. The evidence is in the way immigrants are scapegoated for stealing jobs, or the fear-mongering around terrorism and American Muslims, and the extreme polarization and culture wars that plague our system. If we want to answer the question, could this happen again, we have to examine how fear operates in America today. Are minority groups seen consciously or subconsciously as a threat, whether economic, cultural, or physical, to the point that depriving them of civil rights would be justified? Does fear make it more acceptable to detain immigrant children in cells or impose blanket travel bans on entire countries? If there is a lesson to be learned from the Japanese internment, or the Holocaust, or any subjugation, internment, or genocide of minority, it's that none of these examples are carried out solely by a handful of self-serving men. They were carried out with the consent of thousands of otherwise good people whose non-involvement made them complicit in an atrocious infringement on human rights. In order to convince good people to deprive others of their rights, you have to make good people think it's for their own protection, that their fear is rational and thus their actions are justified. If we begin with this belief that all evil is done by people who believe they are doing good, at some point we have to look in the mirror and ask what our own role is in the perpetuation of racism and injustice in the United States. In January of 1838, President Abraham Lincoln gave a speech to a group of young men at the Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, on the perpetuation of our institutions. He said, in essence, the end of our republic would never come from a foreign attack. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined could not, by force, take us. If it ever reaches us, it will spring up from amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free people, we must either live through all time or die by suicide. Both politically and socially, we will always be at a crossroads, a decision place where political challenges and personal involvement in our country will test us. Threatening conditions of racism, the politics of fear, and the failure of political leadership, along with a flagrant appetite for power and influence, will always be at hand and will either make us a nation of grateful immigrant descendants or break us as a failed democratic experiment. Our first president, George Washington, expressed genuine concern that the alternate domination of one political party over another, allowing one party to enjoy temporary power over the government, would be used to obtain revenge on the other. Washington understood that if a wise people did not do their duty to discourage and restrain the overzealous development of political parties, it would be the end of America and the Constitution. For Washington, as Constitutional Convention President and later President of the United States, his most important role was to create an atmosphere that would allow convention members, framers of our Constitution, to reach the difficult compromises necessary to create a bold new government. Awareness, social consciousness, responsibility, and most importantly, involvement is what the framers of the Constitution called for when they gave us "We the People," the challenge, responsibility, and privilege to use our commitment and creativity to continue the work of forming a more perfect union. This begins with each of us using our voice to vote in our elections and actively involving ourselves in the legislative process. It begins with looking inward to explore the ways we unconsciously perpetuate and participate in various kinds of racism and injustice. And it begins with recognizing that unlearning deeply rooted associations and stereotypes is an ongoing process of reprogramming our brains to be less afraid, more like an ongoing process of brushing our teeth rather than pulling out a tooth and thinking the work is done. The notion of being a responsible citizen doesn't just begin and end at the ballot box. Responsible citizenry includes how we work for justice in our personal lives, at the office, in our schools, in our children's schools, and in our local communities. Our choice and our challenge today is to further the Constitution's promise by engaging our talents, our hard work, our creativity, and our imaginations, whatever it takes, to reinvent ourselves and our country. This isn't the time for business as usual. This is the time for each of us to involve ourselves, standing up for what we believe in, working diligently and purposefully to make it happen. Our families are counting on it. Our neighbors are counting on it. And our country is counting on it.